Margaret sat in the empty auditorium, her daughter's graduation cap still clutched in her trembling hands, watching her husband of 27 years walk away with another woman. The echo of their footsteps on the marble floor seemed to mock every promise he'd ever made, every anniversary they'd celebrated, every dream they'd built together. Just 3 months earlier, Margaret Thompson had been living what she believed was a blessed life. At 58, she had everything she'd ever wanted: a beautiful home in suburban Connecticut, a successful husband who owned a thriving accounting firm, and most importantly, their pride and joy, their daughter Sarah, about to graduate summa cum laude from Yale University. Margaret had spent weeks preparing for Sarah's graduation day. She'd ordered the perfect dress, navy blue with delicate pearl buttons, and had even splurged on new shoes despite David's recent comments about their spending. She'd planned a celebration dinner at Sarah's favorite restaurant, booked a photographer, and sent invitations to their closest family and friends. "Mom, you're going overboard," Sarah had laughed during one of their phone calls. "It's just a graduation." "Just a graduation?" Margaret had replied, her voice warm with pride. "My daughter is graduating from Yale with honors. This is the biggest day of our lives." David had seemed distant lately, working longer hours, taking more business trips, but Margaret attributed it to the stress of tax season. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, she'd learned to recognize his patterns. He'd always been a workaholic, especially during busy periods. She trusted him completely. The morning of graduation, Margaret woke early and made David's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. He barely touched them, checking his phone constantly. When she asked if he was excited about Sarah's big day, he'd simply nodded and mumbled something about needing to handle some last-minute client issues. Looking back, Margaret realized she should have seen the signs. But love, she would learn, can sometimes blind us to the truth that's right in front of us. The first real sign something was wrong came during the graduation ceremony itself. Margaret sat in the third row, her heart swelling with pride as Sarah walked across the stage. She reached for David's hand, the way she always did during meaningful moments, but his palm was cold and clammy. He kept checking his watch, shifting in his seat like he had somewhere else to be. "Are you feeling all right?" she whispered, noticing how pale he looked. "Fine," he replied curtly, not meeting her eyes. When Sarah's name was called, Margaret jumped to her feet, applauding enthusiastically. She looked over at David, expecting to see the same joy on his face, but instead found him staring at his phone screen. During their daughter's moment of triumph, he was texting someone. "David," she hissed, "put that away. This is Sarah's moment." He reluctantly slipped the phone into his pocket, but Margaret could see his leg bouncing nervously. Something was definitely wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos, Margaret noticed David hanging back, avoiding the camera. Usually he loved being in pictures, especially for important occasions. She'd always joked that he was more photogenic than she was. "Come on, honey," she called out. "Let's get a family photo." "In a minute," he replied, but that minute never came. Instead, he spent the time pacing near the parking lot, making hushed phone calls. Margaret tried to push down the growing unease in her chest. Today was supposed to be perfect. She'd been planning this day for months, and she wasn't going to let David's strange mood ruin it. But as she watched him from across the courtyard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Sarah bounded over, her graduation gown flowing behind her, diploma in hand. "Mom, isn't this amazing? I can't believe I actually did." Margaret forced a bright smile, determined to focus on her daughter's happiness. But even as she hugged Sarah tight, she couldn't ignore the way David was looking at them, not with pride or love, but with something that almost resembled guilt. The revelation came during what should have been their celebration dinner. Margaret had reserved a private dining room at the Ivy, Sarah's favorite restaurant since childhood. She'd even arranged for a special cake with Sarah's photo printed on it. Everything was perfect, except for David's increasingly erratic behavior. He'd been on his phone throughout the appetizer course, excusing himself twice to take calls. When Margaret gently suggested he turn it off so they could focus on their daughter, he snapped at her in front of Sarah. "Some of us have responsibilities, Margaret. The business doesn't stop just because it's convenient for you." Sarah's face fell. She'd never heard her father speak to her mother that way. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she swallowed her hurt and tried to salvage the mood. "Of course, honey. I understand. Why don't you take care of whatever you need to, and we'll wait for you." But David was already standing, his phone pressed to his ear. "I have to go," he said, not looking at either of them. "This can't wait." "Go?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "David, this is our daughter's graduation dinner. What could possibly be more important than—" "I said I have to go." His voice was sharp, final. "I'll catch up with you later." Margaret watched in stunned silence as her husband of 27 years walked out of the restaurant, leaving her and Sarah sitting alone with the celebration cake and unanswered questions. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, what's going on with Dad? He's been acting so strange lately." Margaret tried to find words, but her throat felt tight. She'd been asking herself the same question for weeks. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he'd started doing his own laundry, details that seemed insignificant individually, but together painted a picture she didn't want to see. "I don't know, sweetheart," she finally managed, "but we're not going to let it ruin your special day. This is about you and your amazing accomplishment." But even as she said the words, Margaret felt something inside her chest crack. Trust, she was learning, was like fine china. Once broken, it could never be quite the same again. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of David's car in the driveway. He'd texted around midnight saying he was staying at the office to finish up some urgent work, but something about the message felt wrong. In 27 years of marriage, he'd never once spent the night at the office. At 3 a.m., she couldn't take it anymore. She got up, put on her robe, and drove to David's office building. His car wasn't in the parking lot. The next morning, Margaret tried to act normal, but her hands shook as she made coffee. When David finally came home around 8 a.m., his shirt was wrinkled and he smelled like unfamiliar perfume. "How was your night at the office?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Fine," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Just had to get some things sorted out." Margaret wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but something held her back. Maybe it was fear of what she might learn, or maybe it was the hope that she was wrong, that there was an innocent explanation for everything. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, and it came in the form of a phone call that afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Rebecca Martinez from Hartwell Associates. I'm calling to confirm your husband's dinner reservation for tonight at Le Bernardin. He's booked a table for 2 at 7 p.m. Margaret's blood ran cold. "I think there's been a mistake. My husband didn't make any reservations tonight." "Oh, I'm so sorry. The reservation is under David Thompson, and he specifically requested our most romantic table. Perhaps it's a surprise?" Margaret hung up the phone with trembling hands. Le Bernardin was where David had proposed to her 30 years ago. It was their special place. The restaurant he'd always said was ours alone. The thought of him taking another woman there felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, family photos, Sarah's childhood artwork still magneted to the refrigerator, the anniversary card David had given her just 2 months ago that read, "To my forever love." Everything had been a lie. Margaret didn't confront David that night. Instead, she sat in her car outside Le Bernardin, watching through the window as her husband of 27 years fed dessert to a woman who looked barely older than their daughter. The woman was beautiful in a way that made Margaret's chest ache. Young, blonde, everything that Margaret at 58 was not. She watched David laugh at something the woman said, the same laugh he'd once reserved for her. She watched him reach across the table to touch the woman's hand, the same gentle gesture he'd done on their first date. She watched him kiss her in the doorway of their special restaurant, and something inside Margaret died. The drive home was a blur of tears and streetlights. Margaret pulled into her driveway and sat in the dark car, trying to figure out how to breathe around the weight in her chest. 27 years of marriage, and she'd become invisible to the man she'd loved with her whole heart. David came home after midnight, sliding into bed like nothing had happened. Margaret pretended to be asleep, but every fiber of her being was aware of his presence. He smelled like wine and betrayal. In the days that followed, Margaret retreated into herself. She went through the motions of daily life, grocery shopping, tending to her garden, responding to Sarah's excited calls about her new job, but it all felt hollow. She was living in a house with a man who had become a stranger, maintaining a facade of normalcy while her world crumbled around her. She found herself staring at their wedding photos, trying to remember when things had changed. Had she been too comfortable, too trusting, too boring? The questions tormented her, but she kept them locked inside, too ashamed to share her pain with anyone. Sarah called one evening, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I have such good news. I got the job at the marketing firm in Boston. I start next month." Margaret forced enthusiasm into her voice. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." "Is Dad there? I want to tell him too." Margaret looked across the room at David, who was on his phone again, probably texting his mistress. "He's busy with work, but I'll tell him for you." After she hung up, Margaret realized she'd been protecting him, covering for him, even as he was destroying their family. The silence was eating her alive, but she didn't know how to break it. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Margaret was at the grocery store, mechanically pushing her cart through the aisles when she heard her name being called. "Margaret? Margaret Thompson?" She turned to see Linda Walsh, a woman she'd known casually from the country club. Linda's face was flushed with what looked like embarrassment. "Hi, Linda," Margaret managed, trying to summon a smile. Linda approached hesitantly. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something. It's difficult, and I've been debating whether to say anything, but I think you have a right to know." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What is it?" "I saw David last week. He was at the Marriott downtown with a young woman. They were checking into a room together." Linda's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I know this must be devastating." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Hearing it from someone else made it real in a way that her own suspicions hadn't. "How long have you known?" "I only saw them that once, but Margaret—" Linda hesitated. "Some of the other ladies at the club have been talking. They've seen them together at various places around town. Everyone's been wondering if you knew." The humiliation was almost worse than the betrayal. Margaret realized she'd been the subject of whispered conversations, pitying looks and gossip while she'd been living in denial. "I'm sorry," Linda continued. "I know it's not easy to hear, but I thought you should know. You deserve better than this." After Linda left, Margaret stood in the cereal aisle, tears streaming down her face. A part of her was grateful for the confirmation, but another part wished she could go back to the blissful ignorance of not knowing for certain. But knowledge, she realized, was power. And for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something other than sadness stirring in her chest. It was anger, and it was growing stronger by the minute. That evening, she looked at David across the dinner table with new eyes. He was cutting his steak, talking about his day as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been living a double life for months. "How was your day?" he asked, not looking up from his plate. "Enlightening," Margaret replied quietly. Something in her tone must have caught his attention because he glanced up, studying her face. But Margaret's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. The game had changed, but David didn't know it yet. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to watch David with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a specimen. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. How he always tilted his phone away from her when texting, how he'd started wearing cologne to work, how he'd been going to the gym more often and buying new clothes. But instead of confronting him, Margaret made a different choice. she began to plan. First, she made copies of all their financial documents. She discovered that David had been moving money from their joint accounts into a separate account she'd never known about. 27 years of shared savings diminished by his selfish choices. Next, she called their lawyer. Well, her lawyer now. James Morrison had been a family friend for years, and when Margaret explained the situation, his voice was gentle but professional. "Margaret, I'm so sorry you're going through this, but I want you to know that Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. You're entitled to 50% of all marital assets, regardless of whose name they're in." "I don't want to destroy him, James. I just want to protect myself." "That's exactly what we're going to do. But first, we need to gather evidence. Do you have any documentation of his infidelity?" Margaret thought about this. "Not exactly, but I know where he goes, when he goes there. I could get proof if needed." "Let's talk about that. In the meantime, I want you to open your own bank account and start documenting everything. Every unusual expense, every night he doesn't come home, every lie he tells you." Margaret began keeping a journal, writing down David's absences and fabrications with the same methodical precision he'd once used for his accounting work. She photographed credit card statements showing expensive dinners and hotel charges. She took notes on his phone calls and late-night disappearances. But perhaps most importantly, she began to rediscover herself. She'd spent so many years being David's wife that she'd forgotten who Margaret was on her own. She started taking painting classes, something she'd loved in college but had given up after marriage. She began reading again, devouring books about women who'd rebuilt their lives after betrayal. Sarah called one evening, her voice concerned. "Mom, are you okay? You sound different somehow." Margaret looked at herself in the hallway mirror. Her daughter was right. She did look different. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Determination, maybe, or strength. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just learning some things about myself." "And Dad? How is he?" Margaret's smile was small but real. "Your father is about to learn some things about himself, too." Margaret's opportunity came sooner than expected. David announced he was going to a 3-day accounting conference in Philadelphia, but Margaret's detective work had revealed the truth. He was planning a romantic getaway with his mistress at a luxury resort in the Poconos. "I'll miss you," she said as he packed his suitcase, her voice steady. "I'll miss you too," he replied, the lie rolling off his tongue so easily that Margaret marveled at how practiced he'd become at deception. After David left, Margaret put her plan into action. She drove to the resort, not to confront them, but to gather the evidence she needed. She hired a private investigator James had recommended, a professional who specialized in matrimonial cases. But Margaret's real masterpiece was yet to come. She knew David's habits better than anyone. She knew he always checked his email first thing in the morning, usually while having his coffee. She knew he was paranoid about his phone battery dying, so he always charged it on the nightstand. Most importantly, she knew he was careless about his passwords, using the same combination for everything: their anniversary date. While David was away, Margaret accessed his computer and his phone records. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. The affair had been going on for 8 months, not weeks. There were dozens of emails, text messages, and photos that painted a picture of a man who had completely checked out of his marriage. But among the communications, Margaret found something that made her blood run cold. David had been discussing divorce with his mistress, talking about how he planned to leave Margaret with as little as possible. He'd been consulting with a divorce attorney, exploring ways to hide assets and minimize his financial obligations. The man she'd loved and trusted for 27 years had been planning to betray her twice. First with his affair, then with his exit strategy. Margaret printed everything. Every email, every text, every document. She organized it all in a neat folder, the same way David organized his client files. Then she made copies and gave them to James. "This is excellent work, Margaret," James said, reviewing the evidence. He won't be able to deny anything, and his attempt to hide assets actually works in your favor. The judge won't look kindly on that kind of deception. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of control. David thought he was playing chess while she was playing checkers. He was about to discover how wrong he was. David returned from his conference on Sunday evening, relaxed and tanned from his romantic getaway. He walked into the house humming, as if he'd just returned from a legitimate business trip. "How was Philadelphia?" Margaret asked, her voice pleasant and curious. "Oh, the usual. Boring seminars, terrible hotel food." He kissed her cheek, the casual affection feeling like a slap. "How was your weekend?" "Productive," Margaret replied. "Very productive." On Monday morning, Margaret waited until David left for work before making her move. She called James and told him she was ready to proceed. By 10 a.m., David was being served with divorce papers at his office, in front of his colleagues and clients. Margaret knew this because she'd specifically requested that the papers be served publicly. She wanted David to experience the same humiliation she'd felt when she learned the entire country club knew about his affair. Her phone rang at 10:15 a.m. "What the hell is this, Margaret?" David's voice was shaking with rage. "It's called accountability, David, something you seem to have forgotten about. You can't do this. We need to talk about this rationally. The time for rational discussion was 8 months ago, before you decided to start sleeping with someone young enough to be our daughter." There was silence on the other end of the line. "That's right," Margaret continued, her voice steady and calm. "I know everything. About Amanda, about the hotels, about Le Bernardin, about your plans to leave me with as little as possible. I know about the hidden bank accounts and the secret consultations with divorce attorneys." "Margaret, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain, David. It's all very clear. You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." She hung up the phone and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. David came home that evening like a hurricane, slamming doors and demanding answers. But Margaret had prepared for this too. She'd changed the locks that afternoon, and David's belongings were packed neatly in boxes on the front porch. "You can't kick me out of my own house," he shouted through the door. "Actually, I can," Margaret called back. "Check with your lawyer. In Connecticut, when one spouse commits adultery, the other spouse has the right to exclusive use of the marital home during divorce proceedings." Margaret watched from the window as David loaded his boxes into his car, his face red with anger and humiliation. 27 years of marriage, reduced to cardboard boxes and legal documents. But she didn't feel sad anymore. She felt free. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her garden, pruning roses in the soft morning light. The divorce had been finalized the week before, and she'd kept the house, half of David's business, and a generous alimony settlement. The hidden assets he'd tried to conceal had been discovered and divided, and his attempt at deception had cost him dearly in the judge's ruling. Sarah was coming to visit that weekend, bringing her new boyfriend from Boston. Margaret was excited to meet him, to hear about Sarah's new job and her new life. Her daughter had been incredibly supportive throughout the divorce, telling Margaret she was proud of her for standing up for herself. "I never liked how Dad treated you toward the end," Sarah had confided during one of their phone calls. "You deserve so much better, Mom." Margaret had learned that David's relationship with Amanda had imploded shortly after the divorce papers were served. Apparently, the young woman had been more interested in the stability of a successful older man than in the reality of dating someone going through a messy divorce. When the money became uncertain and the situation became complicated, she'd moved on to someone else. David had called several times, wanting to work things out. But Margaret had made it clear that ship had sailed. She'd learned to love herself too much to settle for someone who could discard her so easily. Margaret had enrolled in art classes at the local community college and was considering getting her teaching certificate. She'd always wanted to teach, but David had discouraged it, saying they didn't need the extra income. Now she realized it had never been about the money. It had been about keeping her small and dependent. As she worked in her garden, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The betrayal had nearly broken her, but it had also revealed a strength Salm he'd never known she possessed. She'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you can also be the thing that sets you free. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Can't wait to see you this weekend, Mom. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Margaret smiled, wiping dirt from her hands. She was proud of herself, too. She'd survived the worst betrayal of her life and emerged stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself than she'd ever been. The roses in her garden were blooming beautifully, their roots now deep enough to weather any storm. Moral of the story: sometimes the greatest betrayal can become the doorway to your greatest freedom. When someone shows you who they truly are, believe them. But more importantly, remember who you are. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's ability to see it, and your future isn't limited by someone else's failure to cherish your past. The strength you need to rebuild your life has been inside you all along, waiting for the right moment to bloom.